is full, which is really nice to see. I don't think our students fill all the seats every time. So welcome to this lecture, and thank you all for coming to the University of Manchester for this talk. I'm sure you are all very, very eager to hear Professor David Olusoga, but I have to introduce him, so bear with me for a few minutes before you get him. So in case you're wondering who I am, I'm the head of Department of History here, and Professor Olusoga is our esteemed colleague in the department. He's Professor of Public History. My name is Anindita Ghosh. I'm head of history and also professor of modern Indian history. And there's a lot in common that David and I often talk about, which is about colonialism, empire, and to a certain extent slavery, because some form of slavery also existed in India. Right, so I'm sure you all know who Professor Olusoga is, but I don't think it'll harm us to remind ourselves of his tremendous work so far. So David Olusoga is not only Professor of Public History here in Manchester, but he's widely known as writer, broadcaster, and filmmaker. And I'm sure some of you have seen his works. How many of you have seen his works before or read his books? Hands up. That's a really good number. That's a really good number. I'm so pleased to see that. Right, so what I'm about to say might be familiar, but also to remind ourselves of the many accolades and honors that David has received over the years for this tremendous work that he does, and we're really grateful for him for doing that, because somebody needs to do it, and he's doing a brilliant job of that. But most recently, his BAFTA award in 2023 for outstanding contribution to TV is worth mentioning. In terms of his books, he's written quite a few. I'll mention some of them. Black and British, A Forgotten History, published in 2016. The Black History book, Big Ideas, Simply Explained, which was published in 2021, that some of you might have read already. The World's War, and this was published in 2015. Amongst his films, we have, of course, A House Through Time. That's the first time I saw you, which I enjoyed very much. And then, of course, Time Watch, Black and British, A Forgotten History. Who could forget that tremendous work? The One Show he's been on, various episodes, of course, but also Fighting for King and Empire, Britain's Caribbean Heroes in 2015, and The World's War, Forgotten Soldiers of Empire in 2014. So without further ado, over to you, David, for doing this month's Black History talk.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is the microphone working? Yeah? And Anindita, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. Thank you all for coming. It's so lovely to see you all. I'm very flattered that lots of you have seen my TV programs or read some of my books. So the idea is I'm going to speak for, I think, about 30 minutes, and then we're going to have 20 minutes for questions. And I hope what I say is going to inspire you or provoke you to ask some questions. Please ask me about anything I discuss, anything from my programs, anything from my books. I thought I'd begin, if that's okay, with a little bit about myself. So I'm a public historian. I talk, I write, I make programs about the past. I write books for grown-ups, and I also write books for children. And what I write about and what I make programs about is very varied. About the history of houses, about the First World War, about the Second World War, about the histories of empire, of slavery, and ideas about race. I'm probably best known, as Anindita said, for my books, my series of books called Black and British, books for children, for young children, and also for adults. But I got into history not because I thought I'd be able to write those books, and I certainly didn't become interested in history because I thought about Black history or the history of empire. I was interested in history because when I was growing up, which was quite a long time ago, all the boys in my class, and it was a much more gendered world that I grew up in than the world you grew up in, all the boys were interested in the Second World War. I was interested in planes and tanks and explosions and really kind of boy's own history. Back in the 80s when I was growing up, the Second World War was everywhere. It was movies on television were about the Second World War. There were magazines that children bought about the Second World War. Half the toys were about the Second World War. It was absolutely everywhere. And I didn't think for a second, didn't imagine for a second, that the Second World War had involved people who looked like me or my family. I'm half British, half Nigerian. My father came from Nigeria. Half my family obviously is Nigerian, half my family is English and Scottish. I didn't think there was anybody who looked like me in the Second World War, because all of the programs that I saw on television, all of the films, all of the toys, all of the magazines suggested that the Second World War had been fought entirely by people from Europe, by white people. There was no suggestion that people from Africa or the Caribbean or India or Sri Lanka or any of those countries had taken part in the Second World War. And then one day, my mother stopped me and said, "Do you know that there were men, soldiers from Nigeria, where your father's from, where you were born, who fought in the Second World War?" And I almost didn't believe her, because, as I said, everything I'd worked, everything I was involved in, everything I'd read, everything I'd seen, didn't make that seem possible. I was making a film last year about this, about how we remember and how we misremember the Second World War, one of the most important events in world history. And so what I did was I got a researcher who was working on the program to buy what is now a sort of antique box of toy soldiers. Things were so primitive back in the 80s that we actually played with plastic toy soldiers. It was as boring as it sounds. There were no iPads or Game Boys or Nintendos. And the more I see children playing with them now and see my daughter, the more I resent not having them as I was a child. You were very lucky. The box of soldiers that I remembered, we ordered it and it arrived. And it was of the 8th Army. That was the part of the British Army that fought in the deserts of North Africa against the Germans and the Italians. And the picture on that box was of a series of white soldiers. It was a painting produced for this box of soldiers. It was just as I remembered it when I was a child. And that was the image I had of the Second World War, of the 8th Army, of the war in the deserts in North Africa. That was the picture in the films. That was the picture in the books that I read. The problem is that that army, the 8th Army, as we now know, as people knew at the time, was one of the most diverse, integrated, multicultural, multi-race, multi-faith armies ever created. In the 8th Army were soldiers who came from India. There were soldiers who came from southern Africa. There were soldiers from all over the British Empire, from Cyprus, from various parts of different religions. In the Imperial War Museum in London, there is a series of photographs taken of the 8th Army in the deserts, in North Africa, in the 1940s, during the Second World War. And what you see is this hyper-diversity. People from all over the world. There are a series of pictures of Muslim soldiers who've created an improvised mosque in the desert, marked out with stones on the sand, praying. The real image of the Second World War, the people who fought in that war would have recognized, was completely invisible by the time I was interested in the Second World War as a child, just 40 years later. All of those people from Africa, from the Caribbean, from the Indian subcontinent, had been written out of the story in just 3 decades. And so it was possible for me to delude myself, to convince myself that this had been a war fought by Europeans, by white people, and that non-white people had not been involved. And that moment of realizing that there was missing chapters, missing people, missing persons from the history that I was being taught, that was the moment when I began to question the history that I was taught at school, the history that appeared in popular culture, in films and magazines, in newspapers. And I spent most of my career doing that. And sometimes you can see the moments at which decisions were made that led to certain people, their involvement in history, being forgotten. Because sometimes bits of history are forgotten because we as people forget all sorts of things. History isn't everything that happened in the past. It's what historians choose to remember. And sometimes what we choose to remember is affected by all sorts of natural forgetfulness. We forget lots of things. But sometimes it's not forgetting, it's erasure. Last year I was doing some research on this for a book that one day I'm going to get around to writing, that I haven't so far. And we found a moment about the Second World War that shows how people can be forgotten, how an event that involves people from all over the world can be presented just a few years later, just a few decades later, just a generation later, as one in which they weren't involved, they were invisible. So towards the end of the Second World War, the Allies, Britain, America, France, they realized it was obvious that they were probably going to win the war. They were planning for the invasion of Europe, taking British and American soldiers from Britain, crossing the Channel at D-Day, which I'm sure you've heard of, and invading Europe, releasing from German control the countries Germany had invaded in 1940. And one of the things that they had to plan for was what would happen when they got to Paris. Paris had fallen to the Germans in 1940, and now it was going to be liberated by this Allied army. And what they understood, quite rightly, was that it was really important that it was a French army that was there at the beginning of the liberation of Paris. That when soldiers marched into Paris to free the city that had lived for 4 years under German control, that it was a French army. And there was a French army, even after the fall of France, called the Free French Army. Soldiers who had escaped from France when the Germans invaded, soldiers who'd been in the French Empire in Africa and Asia when France had surrendered to the Germans in 1940. And so the British and the Americans and the French began to plan how this French army would be there at the moment that Paris was liberated. And in documents, which you can find in the National Archives in London and in the archives in Washington, D.C., you can see the conversations that they had about how they were going to do this. And what those conversations show is that the British and the Americans demanded that the French make sure that the army that marched into Paris was a white army. That the soldiers who weren't white, who'd fought in the Free French armies throughout the war, that they were removed from the units that were going to liberate Paris. So what they did was they created, on the insistence of the British and the French and the complicity of the Americans, they created a unit, a regiment, that had never really existed. They went around all of the other regiments, gathered together all of the white soldiers into a new unit, and they took all of the black African soldiers and the brown North African soldiers, who made up 60% of the Free French forces. They took them out, didn't let them take part in the liberation of Paris. So if you go on YouTube tonight and you put in the liberation of Paris and look at the film that was recorded, the film reels that went all around the world in 1944, 1945, what you will see is that that army looks like they're all white. In fact, they're not all white, because what they did was they allowed North African soldiers who were light-skinned enough to remain in their units, because there weren't enough white soldiers for the job of liberating Paris, of being on those trucks, being in those tanks, being on those armoured cars in front of the newsreels. So this was a moment in which the reality, the truth, that the Free French Army had been 60% not white, that men from North Africa, West Africa, had fought for France throughout the war, that truth could be imprinted onto the historical memory in the film that still exists today that you can go and watch on YouTube. And that chance was scuppered. The decision was made to rewrite reality and pretend that black people had not fought in the Second World War for France. These decisions that take some people out of history, recognize others, deny the contributions of some people, that's a big part of what the thing I do call Black History is. It's about trying to reimagine and refill the gaps in history where the contributions and the involvement of people of African heritage, but also of other heritage, that they were extracted from the story, edited out. And you can see this process of editing out throughout British history. It's not just in the Second World War. Because we know in all sorts of ways, because we've had now 60, 70 years of research, we can see multiple areas of the history of this country where people of colour were involved, and yet it's been forgotten. And because it's been forgotten, it means that people of colour today in Britain don't often, or not until recently, had access to a history that includes them. So when people got off the Windrush, the ship that's the symbolic beginning of post-war migration to Britain, when they arrived in Britain in 1948, they didn't know what we know now. They didn't know that there'd been generations, earlier black communities. They didn't know there'd been black Victorians, black Georgians, even black Tudors. People arriving in London in 1948 on the Windrush didn't know that 500 years earlier, a man called John Blank had arrived in that same city. We think he came in the year 1503, and we think he was part of the entourage of of Catherine of Aragon, who'd come to marry not Henry VIII, but Henry's older brother, Arthur. And we've got a picture, we actually have two pictures, of John Blank, a black Londoner who lived in that city 500 years ago. We've got a picture because he appears on a document called the Westminster Tournament Roll, which was a celebration of a tournament held in Westminster in the year 1511 to celebrate the birth of a child to Henry and Catherine. We've got letters from John Blank. We've got a letter from Henry VIII ordering him a gift on his marriage, on his wedding. We've got documents telling us that clothes were bought for him for special ceremonies in the Tudor court. And we have a letter from John Blank demanding a pay rise written to the king. Here is somebody who we can have beginnings of a biography for. We can learn something about who they were, what their personality was, and we can look at them because we have this image. A black guy, a black Londoner, 500 years ago. None of that was known just in the 1940s, 1950s. Before the 60s, there was one chapter in one book about one aspect of black history, and that was it. A chapter about the black Georgians. So we didn't know all of these amazing people. We didn't have access to this kind of astonishing kind of pantheon of black Britons that we now know about. So over the past 50, 60 years, there's been a revolution where people who were always there, these people were never really gone missing because the archives, the documents, the pictures, they were always in the archives. They were always in the art galleries. It's just people had not wanted to go looking for these people. We've now pieced this all together. And the month we've just been through, October, is a month in which we take an American idea called Black History Month, an American format that was brought to Britain in the late 1980s, and we use it to celebrate this really newly recovered, I should say, history. So we have a history that was missing, that was recovered from the archives, and now that's become part of the national story because of this borrowed American device of Black History Month. And yet there's still more work to be done. There's still ways in which Black history is hidden, and sometimes it's right in front of us. Sometimes it's obvious, and yet we can't see it. So I was brought up in the northeast of England, and rather like if you're brought up in the northwest of England, a big part of what I learned at school about history was the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution is absolutely central to understanding the northwest, the northeast. It was the period when cities like Manchester became as wealthy, as big, as large as they are today. It's the period in which all of those beautiful redstone and sandstone buildings in the centre of Manchester and Newcastle and Leeds and Liverpool, that's when they were built. It's the only period in British history when cities like Manchester and the north of England and the central belt of Scotland were as wealthy as the south, when we didn't talk about levelling up because places like Manchester were the most dynamic, wealthy engines of growth in the world. Delegations of people used to come from other countries to Manchester to try to look and see what the future looked like, because this city was so dynamic. And what I was taught at school was all about the Industrial Revolution, about the inventors, the great industrialists, the men who created the machines that had transformed how we produced products, that had created this astonishing wealth. And I was taught about machines that you probably learned about in your classes, like the water frame and the spinning jenny and the flying shuttle. Generations of British children have been taught about how these machines were the basis of the factory system, how the factory system led to mass urbanization, how we became in this country the first majority urban society ever, the first industrial society ever, how Britain led the world in the 19th century. But those three inventions, the water frame, the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, they are all connected to one aspect of the Industrial Revolution, to one industry, an industry that The Economist magazine, that still exists today, estimated 20% of the population, 1 in 5 of people, were to some degree economically dependent on. That they relied on this industry to have enough money to buy enough food. That industry was the cotton industry. Those three inventions are innovations in the cotton industry that was Britain's #1 export in the 19th century. An industry that 1 in 5 people were to some degree dependent upon to have enough food and enough money. And what I was taught at school was every detail about that industry apart from one detail, which is where did the raw cotton come from? And the raw cotton came from the United States, the vast, vast majority of it. It arrived across the Atlantic, having left ports like Savannah, Georgia, Mobile, Alabama, and New Orleans, Louisiana. It arrived in Liverpool. And from there, it came to this city and to the cities and the towns around Manchester, where there were literally thousands of cotton mills, mills where cotton was processed, raw cotton was made into cloth and into yarn, thread. The Manchester Valley, the Lancashire Valley, was the perfect place climatically to process cotton. The Mississippi Valley, where the cotton was grown, was the perfect place to grow it. You need long, dry summers to grow high-quality cotton. To process cotton, what you need is damp air, rainfall. Manchester's always done well on that front. This was the perfect place to process it. That was the perfect place to grow it. This was one industry. Half of it in America, the United States, half of it in England and parts of Scotland. You can't understand the Industrial Revolution without understanding that the fundamental raw material in the thousands of mills of Lancashire, Yorkshire, the central belt of Scotland, that was produced by enslaved Africans. 1.8 million people, half of the 4 million African Americans who were enslaved on the eve of the American Civil War in the 1860s. Now, we wouldn't dream, no one would dream of teaching the Industrial Revolution, making programs about it, writing books about it, without talking about another key raw material, coal. Anyone who wants to study the Industrial Revolution would want to learn about the coal mines of the northeast, the Durham coalfield, the Nottinghamshire coalfield, the great South Wales coalfields. We wouldn't dream of suggesting that we understood the Industrial Revolution without understanding how mining operated, the terrible conditions, the terrible disasters, the amazing cultures created in South Wales, Nottinghamshire, Durham, this infrastructure, this identity of mining communities. And yet we do exactly that. And I've met people 30 years younger than me who were at school just a few years ago who are still being taught the Industrial Revolution without its connection to the stories of enslaved black people in the United States. And those enslaved black people were the most valuable thing in America's economy in the 1860s on the eve of the US Civil War, a war fought around the issue of slavery and whether it should extend into new territories being brought into the United States. What made them so valuable was that the Mississippi Valley and the Lancashire Valley were umbilically connected. They were part of the same economy. This city was built, in part, on labour of black people who never set foot in Manchester or in British soil, but whose involvement, forced involvement in the production of cotton, is fundamental to the economy, to the history, to the infrastructure of Manchester. People don't need to be in Britain to be part of this history. When we talk about Black British history, it's not just about communities who lived here. It's about people in the Caribbean, people in North America, people in Africa, people who were caught in the enormous economic and military and political power of this country in earlier centuries. This history, without it, we can't tell an honest version of how we came to be who we are. The railway line that I travel on every week between where I live in Bristol and London was partly invested in, partly funded by families who'd grown rich on the slave trade and families who'd grown rich on money given to them at the end of slavery when £20 million was given as compensation to the former slave owners. Institutions, universities, charities, newspapers, companies, corporations across this country and across other countries all have connections to this history, connections that traditionally for a long time we've not wanted to talk about. One of the jobs that I do is I sit on the Scott Trust, which is one of the boards that oversees the Guardian newspaper. The Guardian newspaper, of course, used to be known as the Manchester Guardian. Offices were not very far from here. It was founded in 1821 by 11 men, 9 of whom were cotton brokers. They grew wealthy by processing cotton, the vast majority of which was produced by enslaved people in the United States, but some of it by enslaved people in Brazil. One of those men owned enslaved people in Jamaica. The newspaper I write for has links to slavery. The railway lines I use to travel around the country, companies I've worked for, universities I've studied in have links to slavery. Others have links to empire. Britain's history is enormously global. This country, as you know, created the biggest empire the world has ever seen. We can't have an honest version of our history without including these stories of these communities, these shared histories, which sometimes are really uncomfortable. They're about terrible things, like slavery, like the violence of empire. But to take them out, to pretend that the Industrial Revolution has nothing to do with slavery, to pretend or to present a vision in which black people didn't take part in the First World War, the Second World War, that there were no black sailors in Trafalgar, even though we can see their names on the documents, that there were no black soldiers in the Western Front, even though we can see the documents that proves there were, to pretend that Britain's connections to all of these bits of history are either invisible or immaterial, of no importance. That creates a history that has two problems. The first is it's dishonest. The second is these stories of empire, of enslavement, of migration, of movement. These are the stories that explain why our country looks the way it does, why this room looks the way it does. Because for 14% of the population right now in 2023, these stories are also our family histories. The reason that my parents met in Newcastle in the 1960s was because my father was studying at Newcastle University. And the reasons he was there are to do with the Church Missionary Society, to do with the British invasion of Lagos, where I was born, in the 1850s, the conquest of the town my father's from in 1892. Without these histories, none of us and our society don't make any sense. These are the histories that we need, we require, in order to understand why our society looks the way it does and how we all came to be here. Sharing this island, trying to get on, trying to develop and advance in this island. And the statistics for the future are astonishing. By the time you're in your 30s, in the middle of this century, around a third of people in Britain will be minority, ethnic, or mixed. Look at the England football team. 13 of those players are dual nationals. They could play football for another country if they chose, because they have two passports. They reflect the story of the British Empire from Ireland to Nigeria in the 1850s and 1880s. We need this history, not just because it's fascinating, not just because without it we have a history full of missing chapters and half-truths. We need this history because it explains how we came to be here and who we are as a country. I'm gonna leave it there and hope that there's some good questions, some difficult questions, some challenging questions coming from you. I think we've got about 20 minutes. Microphones. Do we have someone to get the microphones to people who would like to ask questions? Or do we not think? Ah, we do. Here we go. So can I have a first question, please? Excuse me? We have a question here. If you just wait for the microphone, will be 1 second. Could you put your hand back up, please, so that we can see you? Right. Okay. So here's our first question. Can we be quiet, please, so we can hear the first question? Thank you very much. Your question, please.
How can we learn our own histories?
Say that again, please.
How can we learn our own histories?
Well, we need help.
No, how can we learn
our own histories? Thank you. We need help. And this is one of the problems that we've had, is that the publishing industry, the people who produce books, have not been very interested in these histories in the past. And they've been especially bad at making histories for children. So I was 16 when I first bought a book about Black British history. That book had only been published 2 years earlier. If I'd wanted to read about that history before that, there were literally no books. The only books that had been written were books that were for university libraries. They were university textbooks, as it were. But there were no children's books about Black British history or about the Empire, none at all when I was growing up. And it's only a little bit better now, because publishers and writers haven't really bothered to write books about these histories for children. And here people like me are at fault, because it didn't occur to me to write children's books until 4 years ago. Even though I had that experience of not having access to this history growing up, it wasn't part of my plans to write children's books. Actually, embarrassingly for me, it took parents stopping me on the street because they recognized me from television and telling me, sometimes instructing me, to write books for children. Now, I think it's a concerning situation when people who care about history, like myself, don't automatically think that writing books for children is as important as writing books for adults. And that really has been the case for a long time. A friend of mine, Peter Frankopan, who wrote a brilliant book on the Silk Roads, the connections between Asia and Europe and the Middle East before the pre-modern era. He had to persuade his publishers, who didn't want to let him write a children's book because they couldn't see the value. So I think that one of the reasons it's been hard to learn your histories is that your generation has been let down by writers and by publishers. So that is beginning to change, but we have to make demands for books. If publishers know people want to buy books, they will ask writers to write them. But there has really been a problem, and you're quite right, it has been difficult. Thank you very much. There was another...
I have a question because I learned from my grandmother that my great-grandmother used to be one of those children who were, one of the black children who were enslaved in the cotton mills here. Why and how do you get all this history about black people?
Thank you very much for your question. Well, one of the very strange things, and one of the kind of shocking things about the story of slavery is we actually know quite a lot about enslaved people. And because the history was lost and it wasn't talked about for a very long time, I think people presumed that we didn't talk about it because we didn't know very much. The irony is we often know more about enslaved people than we do about poor people living at the same time. Because slavery was about money, the slave trade was about money, and it left a record because whenever you're dealing with money, there's accounts, there's insurance details, there's wills, there's inventories. So in a very disturbing way, because these are really shocking documents to see, because these are documents that list human beings as if they're property with values. we know a lot about enslavement. The other thing we know is that people fought against it. There was always resistance. This isn't something where we can only see enslaved people as victims, because they fought back. There were constantly resistance. There was resistance in Africa, people fighting against the slave traders. There was resistance, people rising up on slave ships to try to stop them taking them to the New World, to the Americas, to the Caribbean. And there was resistance and there were rebellions across the Caribbean, across North and South America, wherever slavery was introduced. So we know quite a lot. It's not true that because people were talking about it, that meant that there was no evidence. It meant that people were uncomfortable discussing this uncomfortable history. And the big thing is, it is uncomfortable. It's really difficult to think about people like ourselves living like that, being forced to live like that. And it's uncomfortable. And we need to recognize that for people whose ancestors were enslaved, it's very, very uncomfortable. It's very personal, and it means a lot. But as a wider society, we need to recognize that if we don't talk about it, if we pretend it didn't happen, we're not being honest about our history. So there's a balancing act. It's a very challenging thing to think about your ancestors in terrible conditions. But as a country, we need to recognize our involvement in those terrible things. How do we find a way of doing it? Well, I think that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to find a way of doing this that appreciates that it's really horrible to think about these things. But if we don't think about them, we're not being honest about our past. I hope that answers your question.
What other historical event were there?
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Could you say that again, please?
What other historian event were there?
What other historical events were there?
Yeah.
That involved black people?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we often forget, see, there's the thing that we call black history, which very often is about remembering black people who we can learn about. People like Mary Seacole, who was a doctoress. She was not quite a doctor, but not quite a nurse, something in between, who went to the Crimean War in the 1850s, who was very famous in the 19th century. There's people like her, and we often focus on people like her in Black History Month. But the other form of black history is just recognizing that in normal events, everyday events that aren't just about black people were involved. So the Battle of Trafalgar, 1805, the battle that prevented, or probably prevented, the French from launching an invasion, if they ever got around to it, of Britain in the early 19th century. That's an event that's taught in schools, that's celebrated in museums, that was enormously famous all over the world. And it's just seen as a bit of normal British history. Important event, but just normal history. But it's also part of black history, because if we go to the National Archives and look at the lists of the sailors and the soldiers on the ships at Trafalgar when the British Royal Navy fought the French and the Spanish, what we see are the names of 123 men from the West Indies and 18 from Africa. And we can see where they came from. We can work out from their names, in some cases, what ethnic groups they might have been. We know that some of them had been enslaved. And we can just place black people into a piece of everyday, ordinary, standard British history. And even the people at the time recognise this. If you go to Trafalgar Square in London, or next time you get a chance to go to London, in Trafalgar Square, at the bottom of Nelson's column, are 4 metal panels that depict, they are bas-reliefs, which is their sort of 3D paintings, as it were. And in one of them is a black sailor. Now, he's there because everybody at the time knew that there'd been black sailors. And yet, when you think again about the way that Trafalgar is depicted in films, in television documentaries, you would never think that black people have been involved. So as well as this form of black history which celebrates forgotten black Britons, we also need to remember that perfectly just ordinary people who happen to be black were there in all sorts of events in British history. If that answers your question, I hope.
Why did countries decide to hide their black history?
That's a really good question. I think in Britain, and this is true for other countries, we very often want history to be fun, to be recreation, to make us feel good. Very often we imagine history as a list of heroes and of battles in which we won and wars in which we won. We want it to tell us nice things. When we go, the biggest organisation in this country with the most members is not a football team, it's not a political party, it's the National Trust, which is all about history, about historic buildings, about great stately homes. 5.5 million people are members of the National Trust. And very often, when we go to those sorts of places, to old historic buildings or castles or whatever it might be, we want to be told a history that is recreation. We're doing this at the weekends or in our holidays. And that idea that history has to be entertaining, it has to make us feel good, that creates an impulse in which we want to take out of the history that we present the bits that don't make us feel good, the bits that aren't about heroes, aren't about victories, the things that are terrible, tragic, the bad things that this country did, and not just the good things. When we go to those stately homes, very often what people want to do is look at the beautiful rooms, look at the beautiful gardens. They don't want, very often, to learn about where the money came from to build them. And those stories, where the money came from, very often are links to empire, to the East India Company, to slavery, to difficult parts of our history. So if you want history just to make you feel good, which is, we all want to feel good some of the time, then you need to take out of it the bits that don't perform that function. And as a result, what you end up with is a history that is full of half-truths and half-chapters and missing bits. Many countries at the end of slavery, for example, wanted to brush it under the carpet. I was in the Netherlands earlier this year. The Netherlands is seen as one of the most liberal countries in the world. The Dutch are even less willing, historically, to recognise that they were involved in slavery and the slave trade and violence in their empire than the British. So it's not just this country. As I said, the problems with that approach to history is, first of all, you have a history full of missing chapters and half-truths. The other thing is, just like the Netherlands, it means that you don't have a history that explains why we all came to be there, why there were people from the Caribbean, from Indonesia, living in the Netherlands, why there are people with Dutch names in Africa. Without these histories, the world doesn't really make sense. It might make you feel good, but it doesn't really operate to make sense. And the other thing about these histories is that they don't just belong to us. So the story of Britain and slavery is one that this country is discussing and needs to discuss more, but it's also a history that's, of course, really important in the Caribbean, in North America, where people who are the descendants of those people now live. It's really important in Africa, because it changed where people lived in Africa, how they lived, the religions that they followed, the languages that they spoke, the wealth or the lack of wealth that characterized their societies. So it's not just that what we want history to be can't be the whole story, because there are 2.6 billion people in the world who live in former British empires, British colonies. That's not including the United States. It doesn't like to be thought of as a former British colony. A third of all countries on Earth are former British colonies. So one of the effects of being the most global nation the world has ever seen is that your history is a shared history, not just with everybody on these islands, but with billions of people around the world. And if you only want to focus on the bits that make you feel good, that excludes all of those people here and there, because their histories are connected to the parts which really can't make us feel good. But we still need to recognize, to write about, to talk about, and to confront. I hope that answers your question.
What is a part of Black history that you think should be more recognised in history, today?
Well, I think I've just said that some of this history is really difficult. I think we should also recognise the parts of it which are amazing. One of the exciting things about being involved in an area of history where we're discovering new things. I have friends who are medieval historians, and they very rarely have new discoveries. In Black history, we have new discoveries all the time. So a few years ago, we discovered about a man called William Darby, whose father was a sailor. His mother was a black British woman. He was a black guy born in Norwich. And he became a circus performer and a circus owner. Because the name William Darby is quite boring, he changed his name to Pablo Franchi, much more suitable name for the Victorian circus. We didn't know anything about him just a few years ago. Now we know about his life, we found pictures of him, we know where his grave is. Now, he was one of the most famous performers in Victorian Britain. He performed for Queen Victoria. He ran, owned and operated a circus, as well as being a performer on horses. He was the owner, the impresario, as they say, of his own circus. When that circus arrived in town, they used to march through the streets with their band and their animals to announce the arrival of what was called Pablo Franchi's fair. And that's an amazing story. But what's even more amazing is that 70 years after he died, something incredible happened. The Beatles were in a place called Sevenoaks in Kent. Because they were the Beatles, they had a row. John Lennon went off to an antique shop, bought a poster, and because John Lennon was a genius, he wrote a song which is almost word for word that poster. The song is called Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite. Now, that poster was describing a benefit performance. That meant that it was a special performance of a circus, and all the money went to a man who was retiring, a man called Mr. Kite, and the circus was Pablo Franchi's circus. So in the Beatles song, Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, on the greatest album of all time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, is a song about Pablo Franchi's circus that says Pablo Franchi's fair. So there's a song about a black Victorian who was one of the most famous performers in the 19th century, who was in an album by the most famous and most brilliant performers of the 20th century. You know, we didn't know anything about this incredible life, this amazing story of this fantastic guy who performed for Queen Victoria and is in the Beatles album. So the bits that I think we should talk about more, and not just the very difficult parts, which we do need to discuss. We do need to recognise the violence of empire, the realities of slavery and the slave trade. But we also need to recognise that this history throws up these absolutely astonishing people who we can celebrate and recognise.
So please do correct me if I'm wrong, but during like the early days, like such as Tudor times, people like John Blanc were recognized for their work by Henry VIII and like were giving importance for their work. But then as history progresses, we see that like their existence is taken away from them and they're like not given as much importance as they used to, such as, for example, colonialism happened and like the rule of it, and like that black people couldn't attack white people. So why do you think that happened?
Well, thank you for your question. It's a really important question. What we can see when we look at what we know about black people, what we know about how Europeans thought about black people in the 16th century, when John Blanc was in London, is that the ideas and the stereotypes that we have today didn't exist then. They hadn't been created. Those ideas, those stereotypes, those theories and beliefs about the nature of people of colour were invented later in the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries. We can see lots of confusion in 16th century Europe about the physical differences. There's people who'd never seen people with dark skin. It was really fascinating. And they were confused as to why people looked so different. They were quite excited by it, to suddenly encounter Africans, people who they had not seen before, was a real fascination of the age. But they didn't say, there's a black person, I believe this about them. I think they're good at this and bad at that. Those ideas were invented later, and they were invented to justify slavery. So the good news in that is that these ideas, these stereotypes that still affect our society today, we can look back to a time when they didn't exist. So they were created. And that makes us think that something that was made can in the future, hopefully, if we all work together, be unmade. So there's a real positivity in recognizing that these ideas have a beginning, because something with a beginning can, in theory, have an end. I'm not sure how much time we have. Great.
As a young British and African person, did you receive any racism, and how did it affect you in a good way or a bad way?
So thank you very much. I'll just repeat the question so we can hear. The question I asked is if when I was young, as a person who was half British, half African, did I experience racism?
As a British and African person, did you receive any racism?
Yeah. Well, the 80s was a very, very different time to today. And there was a lot more very obvious racism in Britain. There was racism in the jokes that comedians told. There was racism in television programs. There was racism on the streets. It was a very, very different society. And what there was also was there was lots of racial violence. And if you, for example, go and look at the archives in the John Rylands here in Manchester, you'll see the records of organizations created by black and Asian people in the 80s to try to fight against this sort of racism. And so I actually don't know anybody my age, of my generation, who grew up black or Asian in Britain, who didn't have experiences of racism, who didn't have, in many cases, experiences of racial violence. It's very sad to say that it was a normal experience. It was something that everybody who was not white experienced, but that is the reality. Now, things are much better now, but there are still ways in which race operates in our society in all sorts of ways that are not very often as obvious as they were in the 80s, but they're still there. So, for example, black women in Britain today are 4 times more likely to die of medical complications in childbirth or the weeks after childbirth than white women. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, there's lots of research into that, but race and racial stereotypes, expectations, both of clinicians and of patients, plays a role in that. We know that there's differences in the unemployment rates for black people, and young white people. And people have done all sorts of experiments where they send applications for jobs with different names, obviously African names, obviously Muslim names, and see that those applications are less successful than applications with what seem like white English names. So, although racism is not the same as it was in the 80s, it's not as overt, and there is still racial violence, but it's not as tolerated as it was, that doesn't mean our society's overcome all of these issues. Because I'm afraid it comes down to all of us, if we want to live in a society in which those ideas, those stereotypes are not impacting on people's lives, then all of us need to recognize first that they are, and B, that we need to do something about it. And that's what people mean when they talk about things like being anti-racist, being aware of these issues, recognizing that racism is still alive and that this history of empire and slavery, it's not all in the past. It's not all over. It's not just interesting for historians. It's important because those ideas that come from that history are still active within our society.
What piece of information that you found out shocked you the most?
What piece of information shocked me the most? I was shocked when I saw the documents I mentioned earlier, where the British and the French and the Americans had conspired to take the black soldiers out of the army that liberated Paris, because it was so obvious. I was really shocked by that. The documents that really shock me are the ones where people really believe in the theories and the stereotypes that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, where scientists, people with real authority, people who have positions of power in universities, in governments, they absolutely believe that these ideas about the nature of people of colour are true. You can see that in documents about the black community that emerged in Britain after the Windrush in the 40s and 50s. There's a series of documents in the National Archives describing meetings of the government in the late 40s and 50s in which they complain that working class white people aren't racist enough because they don't see the presence of black people as big a problem as the governments did. Sometimes when people in real positions of power can't question why they believe certain things about certain peoples of certain skin colours, the power of their belief in ideas that have no basis in science, that can be really shocking. But my job is not really to be shocked by documents, and I think I'd be a bad historian if I went to the archives and had to go home because I was so shocked and sit down with a cup of tea. My job really is to recognise these realities and find ways of communicating them. I'm a public historian. My job is to try to be part of public conversations about this history. So I have to get over my shock quite quickly and try to find ways of communicating these ideas. But it wouldn't be normal if when you read shocking documents, you weren't a bit shocked. But thank you for your question. Wow. Some fast arms there.
How can you advise us to help spread the word about Black history or to educate ourselves further?
So I'll repeat it because the mic wasn't working very well. How can we educate ourselves to spread the news of Black history further? Was that about right? Yeah, brilliant. Well, the first thing to say is that it shouldn't be down to you, but it is. You should live in a society, in my view, in which this history is absolutely part of the curriculum. It's a normal part of history. It doesn't need to be dragged out of the darkness and talked about. But I don't think we do live in that society because these histories have been not part of what we've taught in schools, what we've recognized in museums and in books for such a long time that there is still quite a lot of work to be done. But I think you're absolutely right. It is your generation that needs to do something about it. You have lots of advantages. First of all, you're the first generation who were brought up with the internet. When I was growing up, and there were no books on Black British history, there was nowhere else to go. The books were either in the library, the information was either in the textbooks that were taught at school, or nothing. There was no access to it. So I had no other options. My generation didn't have another place to go. You have the greatest knowledge-giving tool that has ever been created. So you have a huge advantage in the fact that you're the first internet generation. You're digital natives, as they call. The other thing is that you recognize that there's a history that's missing. Again, I didn't know there was a history that's missing. The big advantage you have, however, is that your generation and people older than you at teens, 20s at university, for reasons no one really understands, seem to have a very different relationship with history than my generation, your parents' generation. Those of us who were brought up to think history is there to tell us comforting stories about ourselves and our nation got very used to that idea. For reasons I don't understand, and as I said, I don't think anyone's come up with a really good theory for it, your generation seems to automatically understand that some of the reality of history is really difficult, really uncomfortable, and that we need to be comfortable with being uncomfortable if we're really going to engage with history. So a friend of mine who works in a heritage organization, an organization where people go to visit historic sites, what he told me was, this is the stereotype, is that the family group will go to one of these stately homes, the grandparents, the parents, and the kids. And they will all walk around the beautiful buildings and look at the beautiful rooms, look at the art collection. Then they'll wander around the lovely gardens. Then they'll go and have tea and scones in the cafe. And then at some point, the kids will get their phones out, Google it, and see where the money came from. because your generation seems to understand instinctively that there is a backstory, which sometimes is really not very pretty, to everything, to stately homes, to companies and corporations, to universities, to institutions, to phenomena all over our society. And that desire to go looking for the difficult bits and not just accept that it's all lovely and all fluffy and it should make us feel good, that makes you, I think, sort of much more naturally prone to an inquisitive form of history that will lead to a more inclusive form of history. So you have the tools, but there's also something about this generation that is radically different. I live in Bristol. For decades, people in Bristol have complained about the statue of Edward Colston, the slave trader that stood in the center of the city. But it was your generation who removed that statue, who toppled it, who wanted to make a huge statement that went all around the world about whether or not it's right or wrong to celebrate the life of a man who was a slave trader. Now, whether that was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do is up for debate, but the approach of your generation has been radically different. So I think you have enormous advantages that are already obvious and manifest. Hi there.
Hi, what is your perspective on what's going on in Congo, and do you think sometimes media like overlaps what's happening there with what's happening in the Western world?
I think there's a huge disinterest in the media and the television, the newspaper industry with what's happening in Africa. And that reflects a huge disinterest among the audience. I remember talking to somebody from Channel 4 News, one of the most successful news programs in this country, and they knew that if they ended, remember there's adverts on Channel 4 News, if they ended part 2 with the news of what was going to be in part 3, and part 3 was going to begin with a story outside of Britain, that about a quarter of their audience turned off. So there's a huge lack of interest in what happens in Africa, which I think is something that our society needs to, be ashamed of. We seem to be very disinterested in certain parts of the world. And we have an attitude, an idea in journalism. When I was training to be a journalist, I was told that a story had to be judged by what they called the pub door story. Would people be talking about that story if you went into a pub? Well, I don't think pubs are the best place to determine what's important, but also the job of journalism is to lead. It's to say, you might not be knowing about this, but it's important. And I think too often journalism follows rather than leads. And I think the Congo and many other parts of the world suffer because of that.
Do you think it's appropriate for countries that benefited from the slave trade to pay reparations for countries that were impacted by it? And if so, how?
Thank you. Well, I'll be brief. The first thing to say is reparations are entirely normal. British slavery ended with reparations, but the money was paid to the slave owners, not the enslaved. So this is not a new idea. It's not a radical idea. It's not a woke idea. It's not a 21st century idea. It's a normal idea. Germany paid reparations to France after the First World War. It paid reparations to Israel after the Second. The people of Haiti were forced to pay reparations for their own freedom from slavery at gunpoint by the French during the 19th century. Those payments went on until the 1960s. Reparations are historically normal. Japan paid vast amounts of reparations to countries it occupied in the Second World War, and that Japanese financial intervention and technological leadership is one of the reasons why South Korea and other countries are doing so brilliantly well technologically in the 21st century. Reparations are historically normal. Also, reparations are happening. They're not being led by governments. They're happening. The Guardian newspaper is involved in what we call restorative justice, recognizing that 9 of its 11 founders were connected to slavery and cotton slavery and the owning of enslaved people. The Church of England, just this year, announced £100 million in restorative justice for its involvement in slavery and the slave trade. The University of Glasgow, universities in the United States, the University of Liverpool, other universities are recognising and introducing forms of restorative justice for their involvement in slavery and the slave trade. So this process is already happening, and it's happening in one of the most amazing ways as well, because it's not just organisations, families who grew wealthy from slavery. The Trevelyan family, for example, the Gladstone family, the biggest slave owners at the end of slavery, are again recognising, acknowledging the involvement of their ancestors and, to varying degrees and various degrees of seriousness, engaging in forms of restorative justice. So this is not a theory that might or might not happen. This is a practice that's already taking place. And as I said, the big thing to remember is if we can pay £20 million, probably around 16, 17 billion in today's money, to the slave owners, the idea that we would, as a nation, not be able to make financial compensations to the descendants of the enslaved, that to me seems disconnected and quite extraordinarily disconnection between historical reality and future possibilities. As I said, reparations are historically normal. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that brings us to the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.